G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we're looking at my team selection for the Las Vegas Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you are new around here, please do drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Let's get straight into how my team did in Brazil. It was not a pretty picture, and I'm glad I've had more than 2 weeks to digest the outcome of that weekend because again, just seems to be on the end of bad luck in this game. And I don't want to blame luck entirely for how the season has shaken out, but it has very much ruined a number of weekends where I've tried to meticulously plan drivers, chips, and all that good stuff for the weeks ahead and backfired completely. Heading into the deadline last week, to give you, I guess, some background into the decision I made, I decided to run back more or less the same team I had in the previous race in Mexico, and the sole change to the team was moving out Albon for Zhou. That decision itself thankfully worked out, and the reason I elected to go for Ferrari over a team of Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri and Mercedes was that on paper I thought the Ferrari and Lando Norris looked good. Now McLaren didn't look too bad in free practice and sprint qualifying, but I think over the course of 2 weeks where I'd likely have to move Ferrari back in for Las Vegas because their straight line speed at what is essentially a rectangle in Nevada, I think was going to be a decision I'd make at that point in time and would involve multiple -10s to reverse the transfers for 1 week in Brazil. Now on paper, I thought the teams and in the points projections on F1 Fantasy Tools were pretty even. So I thought, the -10s are probably not going to be worth it. Let's build a little bit more budget out of Carlos Sainz for 1 more week, move out I guess an asset in Alex Albon, which ultimately DNF'd again, and kind of run it back, which I've more or less had the same team for the last few weeks if you've been following along on YouTube and Twitter. Again, though, meticulous planning, patience of building budget and setting my team up for the 3X in Qatar just clearly hasn't reaped the reward I would have hoped. Sainz has had DNFs in Baku and now again in Brazil. His prices certainly fluctuated the last few weeks despite looking really good in Circuit of the Americas, at Mexico, for example. But I think my strategy of planning out my team, my chips, aiming for certain value changes has pretty much gone up in flames because of DNFs and the like. And it's very much been the theme of the season, unfortunately. So that's just how it goes. And I think I'm more or less backed into a corner of going with Lando Norris and Sainz or Leclerc and Piastri on my 3X in Qatar, unless, of course, Piastri or Leclerc DNF in Las Vegas and Sainz goes up 0.3 million. So unfortunately, that's just how the cookie crumbles. But this is the reason why I've got a screenshot of my team ranks on screen here. I don't usually do that. But the two teams I've been running, Team 1 and Team 2, have been more or less identical throughout the season. And the sole difference makers in the ranks have been 1, DNFs, and 2, essentially going for 2 strategies into the deadline and choosing 1 for Team 1 and 1 for Team 2. The opposite for Team 2 being whatever strategy I elected not to go with for Team 1. So the shoe could very much be on the other foot for my Team 1, and that's just, I guess, how it goes in F1 Fantasy with DNFs and price changes, and obviously that is how it can affect your rank at the end of the season. So another rank slide of about 3,000. Top 10k does feel very much out of reach unless I have a bit of luck in these next couple of weeks on differentials and such, because that's kind of how my approach will be between now and the end of the year. But yeah, not a great weekend in Brazil. Very happy to look forward to Las Vegas. A lot more to look forward to there, and I think that's something to after last year's surprises. I think we'll see a few more of those in Sin City. Now, overlooking the race for this year, we only have 1 year worth of data, and last year was a very high overtake track. 2023 was second only to the Dutch Grand Prix, that wet weather race we saw a number of drives in Las Vegas from drivers starting much further back, coming all the way up into the points and racking up a bunch of positions gained and overtakes. Ocon went from P16 to P4, Lance Stroll went from P19 to P5, and Oscar Piastri went from P18 to P10 and also picked up the fastest lap. So all 3 of these guys had 39 or 40 points. I wouldn't be surprised if we see something similar again this season. And I think that affects, for certain teams and their transfer flexibility, decisions they could make into the deadline, which would perhaps be differential to what many of the teams currently look like at the moment. So I'm very much eyeing off high overtake potential drivers, the likes of K-Mag, who returns after sitting out Brazil, Hulkenberg potentially if he qualifies out of position, the Alpines, although they drove a boat in Brazil, you just never know what to expect. And even Lawson and Tsunoda are also perfectly fine options. So we'll talk about what that could mean for your team selection. Now, speaking of other midfield drivers, there was talk Williams may not be able to field both cars. At the time of recording, it seems that they will be able to have both drivers feature in the Grand Prix. There was obvious risk around whether or not they'd have the requisite parts needed for both cars after both Colapinto and Albon DNF'd in Interlagos. So it doesn't seem likely that they will fail to have one of these drivers on the grid. There was the possibility of maybe only fielding one car. We saw that happen in Australia where Albon, after Sargent crashed, drove Sargent's car. Now, unless we see an issue in free practice from either of these two guys, I'd hazard a guess that we will see Albon and Colapinto, but perhaps a reason to think about avoiding a double up on these two guys between now and the end of the year, because if they do have any future incidents with how few chips people have left, it's possible they may not be able to have both drivers on the grid. So tread carefully with Williams. I think Colapinto at his price, he's a perfectly fine enabler. But thinking about my team earlier in the week when there was rumors that Williams wouldn't have both drivers, having to get in double Sauber and I don't know, a Gasly, for example, meant a hybrid of McLaren and Mercedes for my team. So I really hope it doesn't come to that for the last 3 races on the calendar, because it would certainly uproot many an F1 fantasy team if Colapinto, for example, at the second cheapest price in the game, wasn't able to feature. Now, what are the risks and considerations we should be thinking about this weekend? I think we're going back to another straight track. We know the risk that comes with racing at these kind of circuits. And Las Vegas is known to have, at this time of year, very cold temperatures. When I was at the race last year, it was between 5 and 10 degrees on all 3 nights. It's going to be very much the same again this time around. So I would think that may affect the performance of some cars. We've, talked about Mercedes particularly having certain performance improvements in the car itself in colder climates. We didn't really see that in Mexico as anticipated, but I think that could very much affect the running order in free practice on Thursday and Friday. So keep that in mind. There's also minimal runoff areas. I do think if you've got chips available, those insurance chips, as I like to call them, the no negative and the autopilot, consider using one of those this weekend if you want to mitigate this kind of risk. We saw a driver, Lando Norris, last year who was on track for completing every lap in the Grand Prix, actually DNF in Las Vegas. So he can even hit the best drivers on the grid. So if you're worried about this kind of risk that can pose to your team, then I wouldn't hesitate to deploy either of those 2 chips, particularly if you've got the 3X to use in Qatar. If you've got the no negative but not the 3X, then I think there's an argument for saving a no negative for Qatar as well, because it's a sprint race weekend. But I think it would be perfectly fine to use in Las Vegas as well. Now, I'm looking at a couple of different lineups for this week, and Max Verstappen, after his incredible drive in Brazil, where he put himself back on the fantasy radar, he'd been in the wilderness for a number of weeks just because of his price and the fact Red Bull have not been a competitive car this second half of the season. But he set some incredible records, one particular record, in fact, in Interlagos that I will just bring up on screen for you now. So Max set a record of 77 fantasy points, the highest ever score for a driver in a single weekend in F1 Fantasy over the last 3 seasons. Credit to F1 Fantasy Tools for this information. He outstripped his previous record of 75 in Belgium, where he also started with a grid penalty, racked up overtakes, positions gained, driver of the day, fastest lap, all that good stuff. On the other side of the coin, Nico Hulkenberg actually had the lowest ever score for an active driver in a single weekend with minus 42. So he, as we know, was a DNF in the sprint race and then was disqualified from the Grand Prix when the marshals pushed his car. So he now has the record for not just the lowest, but also the 3rd lowest after his DNF and disqualification in Monaco. I don't think Hulk's going to have these every single race weekend. Funnily enough, his only 2 DNFs this season have also been on weekends when he's been disqualified in a corresponding session. So I think the omens are slightly better for him in Las Vegas than they were in Interlagos. And I do like him as an option heading into the Las Vegas Grand Prix. But just something to think about, and why Max in particular is on the radar this weekend in Las Vegas. I think, as we saw probably around the midpoint of the season, Max and 4 premium midfield drivers at a track where there are going to be a lot of overtakes does have a compelling argument. I don't necessarily think that it is objectively the best option, and I think the traditional lineups of Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri or Charles Leclerc is going to still be popular. And I do think Max's ceiling on a non-sprint weekend isn't going to be as high. There's no talk of him taking another grid penalty. He typically won't get driver of the day unless he has these mammoth drives from the back of the field. So I highly doubt he's going to come even close to hitting 40 points, let alone 77. He'd have to probably take over the entire grid twice to even get close to that number in the same race. So I think it's a differential option going Max and 4 premium midfield drivers, but I think Norris and one of either Leclerc or Piastri, or even Leclerc and one of Piastri or Sainz, and slightly better midfield drivers for the second option does have an argument. And I think the pros massively in favor of the traditional Norris and one of Oscar and Charles is because you're covering off 2 drivers in objectively the 2 best cars right now, the likely driver of the day, and a very high chance of a fastest lap as well, which you don't have in Max Verstappen. You'd have to see a lot of overtakes in the 4 midfield drivers you select in that left-hand option to really match the likely production that driver of the day and fastest lap would have. So I think, and for good reason, option 2 is going to be, again, the most popular option. But I think option 3 has its arguments too. It's a differential lineup. A lot of people, understandably so, will have Lando Norris in their team. And we'll just bring up the elite data from F1 Fantasy Tools. In the top 500 global teams, Lando Norris is owned by 98% of players. So I think, sure, going without Lando Norris comes with the risk, and if he does well, then I think that would set you back. But if he doesn't look overly convincing in free practice, then I think going against him is a really nice differential, and I really like Charles Leclerc as that option. He's objectively a better driver than his teammate, and I also think that Norris and Leclerc, if we just quickly pivot across to 2024 fantasy points, if we just bring up the average, I'm not saying they are one driver or Norris is objectively better than Charles Leclerc, but their scores are really not too dissimilar. So, for example, if we start from Monza, Leclerc outscored Norris by 10, but then Norris outscored Leclerc by 10. Norris outscored Leclerc by 14, and then Leclerc outscored Norris by 25. It's been pretty even, more or less, the last 5-6 races. So I do like both of these options. Obviously, Leclerc won't have team orders, but I think those team orders for Norris is more or less going to last only one more race, assuming Max wraps up the Drivers' Championship this weekend, which I think is highly likely. So something to think about there, but I do really like the second the option number 3 on the right-hand side if you're chasing rank, and if I don't do it this weekend, I most certainly will consider it in Qatar. And it could pay off if Lando has another stinker. He hasn't looked by any means otherworldly. His scores in the last 6 races are trending down. So starting from 56 in the Netherlands, is gone down with his total points every single race in that last 7 race span. So just something to think about. I wouldn't say Ferrari's trajectory is flying, but certainly a consistent beacon of hope in Charles Leclerc. So really liking those combinations on screen here. I think you could go for any one of them and they'd be perfectly fine for this weekend. Now, just quickly on midfield drivers, I do think the A and B tier ordering is more or less the same. Max's stock understandably going up, but I don't think there's really much change in the way of business in the A and the B tier. In the C tier, we saw Alpine put in a really good race in Brazil. Now, do I see this same performance being replicated in Las Vegas? Highly unlikely. People have compared that car to a boat because it does better in the wet than it does in the dry. I still can't fault Ocon. He is close to the B tier, I will say that. He's 14.8 million. If he goes up again in price, he is, in my opinion, just as bad as Fernando Alonso to own. But I think to my point earlier about if you've got enough budget to build out your team, your midfield drivers with more premium options in that C tier asset class, then I really like, Ocon, Magnussen, Hulkenberg potentially. And yes, his stock, in my opinion, has fallen just a little bit after last weekend. But I think that also is contingent somewhat on him qualifying slightly out of position. We know he's a very good qualifier. If he qualifies P8, P9, P10, I think his appeal is lessened significantly. But if he goes out in Q1 or kind of lower down the order in Q2, then I think Hulkenberg becomes a very appealing option as well. And then you throw in the RBs, I think they're perfectly fine. And Zhou's stock, just because he's a P20 merchant, he's going to go out in Q1 every single week. He's going to be behind his teammate every single week. That puts him slightly up the leaderboard. Albon's DNF risk, there's just not enough production consistently from him to justify inclusion week in, week out. I know the upgrades from around the Netherlands that Williams brought looked good, but he's just not really convinced me, and I think last weekend was the last straw for me. I'm glad I moved off him. I'd be very surprised if I bring him back in before the end of the season. So Albon's probably an avoid when you've got someone like Zhou just picking up points and price rises from starting at the very back. So that's more or less my opinion on the C tier asset class, but I think you could very much mix the order of all of those drivers week to week. On the DRS boost, I've already talked about, I think Norris and Leclerc are probably the best two options for this weekend. If Ferrari's straight line speed at this rectangle track works out, then I think Leclerc could be really good. And then on the chips, we've again talked about it. High risk track for those factors mentioned before. No negative and autopilot. Very much a consideration for this weekend. So I would, if you've got the 3X lined up for Qatar and you've got one of these two, I'd very much think about using it in Las Vegas. And we'll jump across to my team now because I myself have a few decisions to make this weekend. So I'll just bring it up for you guys, walk you through some of my thoughts. So that's what I've currently got. And I think probably will stick with this just for one more week with Sainz as a B tier asset. Try and squeeze out a bit more value. But as I've said for the last few weeks, when I've tried to do that, it's blown up in my face. So I probably will risk it for one more week. Hope that Sainz gets a bit of budget, and you can see here 24.9. I'm 0.6 million away from Oscar Piastri. So Piastri would have to drop in price 0.7 million, or Leclerc even, to do to afford him on the 3X in Qatar. Now I could potentially in Qatar bring in Mercedes. I'm currently 0.2 million, but if Piastri goes up 0.1, Sainz goes up 0.3, I could just afford that lineup. I wouldn't be pleased about owning Mercedes as a constructor, but I think the 3X chip is the priority at that point in time. So that's one such option I would consider in a week's time. I think for Las Vegas, though, unless there's glaring deficiencies in Ferrari's performance, I would probably go down the Lando Norris, Carlos Sainz route for the budget gains. The alternative, as I also talked about, is a Leclerc Piastri. I'm just not going to see these budget gains from these two A-tier assets in Vegas, I don't think, unless, again, Norris DNF'd or Sainz DNF'd. But at that point, I could more or less afford this in Qatar anyway. So I'm, as a differential at least, so I'm leaning towards Lando Norris and Sainz for one more week. I really can't see myself making many other changes with my budget. I think 9.8, does that... I think I can't even get to an Alpine because both Gasly and Ocon went up. Gasly went up 1 million. So if he'd gone up even 0.5 million, I'd be able to... I still wouldn't be able to afford him. But I guess the point is my budget's completely shot in the foot. But I think that's where I see myself going for. I could ultimately roll the transfer one more week, as I have done the last few weeks. Unless, of course, I want to go slightly differential. Maybe Mercedes, if they pull something out of the hat in free practice, I could take a risk on the constructor. That would give me 10.2, which, again, I think is not going to be enough for my team. So I'm stuck in the mud regardless with what I've got. Unless, of course, I decided to go a double up on Mercedes. And this would mean I'd have to see Lewis and George kind of top 4 in all 3 free practice sessions to even give that some serious thought. I'm not ruling out anything at this point in the season because realistically, I'm so far down the leaderboard that it doesn't really matter at this point if I'm 15,000 or 50,000. So I'd happily have a few punts this week if it meant chancing my hand at improving in the ranks just a little bit. So could go down this route, but it's very much up in the air until we see free practice. Now, this will be my only video for this week because I will be at the Las Vegas Grand Prix. I will be there for free practice on the Thursday and the race on the Saturday. Very excited for this week, and that's why I won't have time to record a preview and final thoughts video. So try to lump in as much content into this as possible. So let me know, first of all, if you're going to be at the race, because it would be great to catch up. The other reason for being in Vegas is that the fantasy formula, if you follow FanAmp on YouTube, you'll know I co-host a show with Adam and Terry twice a week. And this will be the first time the three of us will all be connecting in person. Had the privilege of connecting with Adam before in person, but Terry's coming over from the United Kingdom. So very excited for this opportunity. We've got something very excited lined up for the show that will be broadcast before free practice on Thursday. So stay tuned for all of our channels for more information on that. And we also interviewed Lawrence Barretto, with that interview dropping tomorrow on Monday, November the 18th, if I can get my dates correct. So what's happening this week? And while just quickly on the topic of the fantasy formula, there's also something very exciting in the works for all of you guys watching this coming soon. I can't say much more about it at this time, but all of the leading F1 fantasy content creators have contributed to this piece, and that will be announced formally on FanAmp's channel very soon. So keep your eyes peeled for what that consists of, because I think it will very much interest you. It's been very exciting to be a part of this, let's call it an initiative, and we're very much looking forward to getting the feedback from you guys on that, given the fact we've sourced input from all of the F1 fantasy content creators on Twitter. But it's a very exciting week ahead. Lots happening. So I wanted to get this video out well in advance of the deadline, so you have enough time to think about all the key talking points heading into the Las Vegas Grand Prix. There's so much happening. I couldn't be more excited with 3 races left on the calendar, and very much looking forward to seeing how the Las Vegas Grand Prix unfolds. So if you're at the race, let me know. There's plenty of meetups and events that FanAmp are coordinating, so we'd love to see you at any of those if you are attending Las Vegas. But in the meantime, guys, as always, I want to thank you for all of the ongoing support and encouragement. It's been a challenging fantasy season. We've got 2 races left, and I think it's going to be a blockbuster triple header to close out 2024. So thank you again, everyone. Good luck with your teams this weekend, and I'll see you all very soon.